Hey guys, tonight we're going back to pre-industrial Europe to explore how wool became cloth long before factories, from the fleece of a living sheep to the woven fabric carried through homes, workshops and markets. It was a slow chain of work, spread across many hands and landscapes rather than gathered under one roof. A warm coat could begin in a windswept pasture, pass through a cottage doorway, and eventually reach a distant town without a single machine in sight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a quiet meadow at the edge of evening, where a flock rests beside a stone boundary wall, and the first cool shadows settle over its heavy fleeces. Before cloth, before yarn, before the patient movement of a spindle, there is only the animal, the pasture, and the careful work of gathering what the season has grown. The quiet meadow settles into long, cool shadows as the sheep rest together against the boundary wall. A soft, steady breath rises from the flock, inviting the tired mind to let go of the day's concerns and drift into stillness. Across the valley, the pale autumn grass bends under the early evening wind, marking the slow turn of the seasonal calendar that governed rural work long before the rise of mechanized mills. This journey into the quiet work of making wool begins not in a single universal cottage, but across distinct landscapes, centuries, and communities where fiber was gathered, sorted, spun, and woven under widely varying local customs. From the rolling downlands of southern England in the 13th century to the upland pastures of Castile and the smallholder crofts of Scandinavia, sheep husbandry was bound to regional geography, breed characteristics, and the practical demands of household survival. The sheep themselves were far from uniform across pre-industrial Europe. Local breeds varied enormously in size, horn structure, and the specific qualities of their coats. Some animals carried coarse, hairy outer coats designed to shed heavy winter rains, paired with softer undercoats that held warmth. Others, through centuries of selective regional management, produced finer, more even fleeces well suited for specific types of yarn. These animals grazed on common pastures, woodland fringes, or enclosed meadow systems, their movements shaped by communal grazing rights, manor regulations, and the availability of winter fodder. The work of tending these flocks was shared across households, though responsibilities shifted according to local custom, season, and social standing. In some rural communities, younger members of the household or hired shepherds walked the flocks daily to distant pastures, returning them to folds at night to gather manure for arable fields. In other regions, smallholders kept only a few animals close to the homestead, integrating sheep-keeping directly into a mixed routine of crop cultivation and cottage craft. The scope of this narrative follows the fiber as it moves away from the living animal through a sequence of human hands, tools, and workshops. Yet this movement was never a single straight line from pasture to finished cloth. The path diverged early, shaped by whether the wool was destined for a heavy, felted woolen cloth or a smooth, lustrous worsted fabric. These two broad pathways required entirely different methods of preparation, spinning, and finishing, often practiced by different craftspeople operating under distinct economic arrangements. In some periods and regions, all these preparatory steps took place within the same domestic dwelling, where family members balanced textile work alongside agricultural duties. In others, particularly by the later medieval and early modern periods, specialized artisans concentrated on narrow stages of production, sorting, combing, spinning, weaving, fulling, or dyeing, each working in separate workshops bound by guild regulations or merchant contracts. The rhythm of this labor was tied to the natural world, yet it was also heavily structured by human institutions. Manor lords, urban merchants, and guild wardens exerted varying degrees of control over how wool was gathered, processed, and traded. Taxes, tithes, and customary dues meant that a portion of every fleece left the producer's hands long before it could be spun into yarn. Markets and fairs, held at appointed times throughout the year, drew buyers from distant towns who traveled to purchase raw wool or semi-processed yarn, linking isolated rural valleys to broader regional and international trade networks. Understanding this pre-industrial labor requires setting aside modern notions of uniform efficiency and romanticized pastoral ease. The work was demanding, repetitive, and deeply physical, carried out in all kinds of weather, using simple iron tools, wooden implements, and organic materials gathered from the immediate environment. It required patience, tactile skill, and an intimate knowledge of animal fibers that could only be acquired through years of practice. Within the domestic economy of many regions, wool preparation was integrated into the darker months of the year, forming part of a continuous cycle of household maintenance. When fieldwork slowed with the onset of frost and shorter days, indoor spaces shifted focus toward carding, combing, and spinning. Yet the organization of this work varied significantly by social stratum and geography. In some areas, peasant families produced cloth primarily for their own use, exchanging only small surpluses at local markets. In other districts, specialized rural producers worked entirely on commission for urban merchants, who supplied the raw materials and collected the finished yarn or woven pieces. The legal status of the workers also varied widely. Unfree tenants on manorial estates owed specific labor services alongside their craft duties, while independent artisans in chartered towns operated under the strict oversight of trade guilds that regulated output, tools, and the training of apprentices. These institutional frameworks shaped every stage of the fiber's journey. Guild statutes often forbade night work to ensure uniform quality and prevent unfair competition, while merchant houses established extensive networks that spanned multiple river valleys, connecting upland sheep raisers with lowland weavers and urban dyers. The sheer diversity of regional practices meant that no two workshops functioned in precisely the same manner. A weaver in a Flemish town experienced a very different daily routine from a cottage weaver in the Welsh hills, even though both utilized wooden handlooms and processed animal fibers. Similarly, the tools themselves evolved slowly over centuries, varying from region to region in size, weight, and timber selection, reflecting local woodworking traditions and the specific characteristics of the wool being handled. Beyond the immediate household and the urban workshop lay the wider landscape of pastoral management, which determined the very structure of the fleece before harvest. In regions with harsh winters, such as parts of upland Britain or mountainous Central Europe, sheep were housed in sheltered stone folds or low barns during the coldest months, subsisting on stored meadow hay and leaf fodder. This controlled winter diet directly influenced the strength and cleanliness of the wool fiber, often leaving a distinct seasonal marker, known to handlers as a hunger line or break, where hair growth slowed during periods of scanty nourishment. Shepherds learnt to recognize these variations across the animal's flank, shoulder, and breech, understanding that a single fleece contained multiple grades of fiber suited for vastly different ends. Adding further complexity to pastoral routines, transhumant systems in Mediterranean and alpine regions required annual migrations where flocks traveled dozens or even hundreds of miles between lowland winter pastures and high mountain grazing commons. These long journeys exposed the animals to shifting climates, briars, and dust, altering the accumulation of vegetable matter and grease within the coat. Herders navigated these seasonal routes under ancient legal codes and grazing compacts that balanced the rights of migratory flock owners against local agriculturalists. Every environment left its signature embedded in the fleece, ensuring that the raw material arriving at the homestead or workshop carried the distinct history of the terrain it traversed. To safeguard the health of the animals and maintain the quality of the harvest, pastoralists also engaged in periodic dipping, washing while still on the hoof in certain southern European districts, or applying protective ointments made from tar and grease to ward off parasites. These preventive measures varied widely depending on local veterinary traditions and the dampness of the climate, leaving residues that subsequent washing stages would later need to address. As the evening air grows cooler and the stillness deepens over the landscape, the sheep rest quietly in their enclosures, their dense fleeces undisturbed. The natural oils, protective salves, and accumulated dust of months of grazing remain locked within the fibers, holding the warmth of the animal against the coming change of season. The heavy coat, shaped by breed, pasture, climate, winter shelter, seasonal migration, and early care, stands ready for the transition. The long process of harvest and handcraft approaches its quiet beginning, waiting for the skilled hands that will soon gather the wool from the resting flock. The first pale light of morning stretches across the dew-covered grass, touching the quiet stone walls of the fold where the flock stirs from its rest. The transition from the resting pasture to the activity of harvest begins not with sudden haste, but with a deliberate gathering of animals according to local seasonal rhythms. Across pre-industrial Europe, the timing of this removal varied widely, depending entirely upon regional climate, the receding of winter cold, and the natural rise of the new spring fleece underneath the old coat. In some Mediterranean and Iberian districts, shearing took place relatively early in the year, before the intense summer heat began to stress the animals and dry out the natural oils within the fibers. In northern regions, such as parts of Scandinavia or upland Britain, the work waited much later into the calendar, often deferred until settled warm weather ensured that newly shorn flocks would not suffer from sudden chills or unseasonable frosts. The organization of this labor required coordinated effort, drawing upon networks of neighbors, family members, or bound tenants depending on the social structure of the manor or village. On larger estates in medieval England, customary tenants owed boon works specifically for the shearing season, gathering at the Lord's fold under the direction of the bailiff to process hundreds of animals within a narrow window of days. In smaller peasant holdings across Central Europe, families pooled their labor, moving from one small homestead to another in a continuous rotation of mutual assistance. This shared work was physical and demanding, requiring sustained concentration and physical endurance as handlers managed restless livestock within confined working spaces. Before any metal touched the fleece, the animals had to be gathered, penned, and restrained with steady, practiced movements. In many regions, sheep were driven through shallow streams or holding pens of hurdle and wattles to settle the dust and remove loose debris from the surface of the coat, though a more thorough cleansing often awaited a later stage. Once penned, individual animals were caught and brought out to the shearing floor, which might consist of clean straw spread across a barn floor, a smooth turf patch beside the fold, or a raised wooden platform designed to save the shearer's back from strain. The method of restraint varied by regional tradition and the temperament of the local breed. Heavier, horned sheep required two handlers or specific locking holds to keep the animal calm and immobile, while smaller, more docile breeds could be tipped securely onto their rumps, resting comfortably against the shearer's knees while their legs remained free. The primary tool for this work was the hand shear, a simple spring instrument forged from iron or steel, consisting of two blades joined by a resilient arched bow. Unlike modern mechanical clippers, these shears relied entirely on the hand pressure of the operator, who squeezed the bow to close the blades and allowed the spring steel to push them apart again after each cut. The construction of these tools varied across regions and centuries. Some blacksmiths forged broad, heavy blades suited for slicing through coarse outer hair, while others produced narrower, finely tapered edges designed to glide close to the skin of finer-wooled sheep without nicking the flesh. Maintaining the edge required constant attention, and a sharp whetstone sat close at hand on a bench or tucked into a leather belt, ready to be drawn across the steel whenever the metal began to drag against dense knots of wool. The motion of the shearer was smooth and methodical, following a set pattern of strokes that swept across the animal's body from the belly and flanks up toward the shoulders and back. Experienced workers developed a rhythmic workflow that minimized stress for both the animal and the operator, keeping the skin taut with one hand while the blades moved in short, continuous clips. The goal was to remove the entire fleece in a single, unbroken sheet or pelt, keeping the interlocking fibers aligned and preventing the wool from breaking into small, unmanageable fragments. This required an intimate understanding of the animal's anatomy, as different parts of the body presented distinct contours, wrinkles and skin folds where the blades had to be handled with extreme care. As the wool came away from the body, the process of sorting often began immediately at the edge of the shearing floor. Assistants or skilled handlers gathered the falling fleece before it could touch the dirt, spreading it out upon a clean hurdle, a woven mat, or a stretch of coarse linen cloth. Even within a single fleece, the quality of the fiber was far from uniform. The wool from the shoulders and upper sides was typically finer, cleaner, and more even in staple length, while the wool from the breech around the hind legs tended to be coarser, longer, and more heavily soiled with dung and vegetable burrs. The belly wool and throat clippings, carrying distinct impurities and shorter fibers, were separated out almost as soon as the fleece was laid flat. This immediate separation reflected the destination of the yarn and the expectations of the local market or household economy. In some districts, particularly where independent smallholders processed their own clips for domestic use, the entire fleece might be kept roughly together, with sorting deferred until washing and carding. In regions tied to commercial cloth production, such as parts of the Low Countries or the English wool-producing counties, buyers, merchants, or specialized sorters inspected the fleeces immediately upon removal, grouping them by grade, fineness, and color before the wool was packed into sacks or wool pokes for transport. Beyond the immediate rhythm of clipping and grouping, the shearing floor was also a site where the subtle health markers of the flock became visible to experienced hands. The condition of the skin revealed whether the animal had suffered from nutritional stress during winter months or parasitic irritation, prompting adjustments in flock management for the following year. Furthermore, the handling of different regional breeds demanded specialized techniques. Shearing an animal with dense, fatty grease required frequent wiping of the iron blades to prevent slippage, whereas drier fleeces allowed for a swifter, more fluid cutting stroke. These subtle adjustments highlighted the deep empirical knowledge embedded in rural labor, passed down through generations without written manuals or formal instruction. In addition to blade maintenance and anatomical awareness, the physical layout of the shearing site often incorporated temporary shelters or canvas awnings to protect the freshly stripped fleeces from sudden afternoon squalls or direct, scorching sunlight. Rapid exposure to intense heat could dry out the delicate animal oils within the raw fiber, making the subsequent cleaning and drafting stages significantly more difficult for the processors. Consequently, handlers worked with steady diligence to bag or cover the gathered wool as soon as a sufficient quantity had been accumulated on the sorting cloths. The labor involved in this harvest was continuous and repetitive, stretching across daylight hours until the pens were empty and the shorn sheep stood huddled together, looking remarkably small and vulnerable in their close-clipped coats. The discarded fleeces, still holding the natural warmth of the animal alongside the heavy weight of grease and regional dust, accumulated in large, fragrant mounds around the workspace. Each fleece represented months of careful pasture management, winter feeding, and seasonal weather, now collapsed into a dense, irregular mass awaiting its next transformation. As the shadows lengthen across the sorting tables, and the evening air begins to cool the damp ground, the scattered piles of wool reveal their uneven parts. Coarse locks, fine shoulder wool, and tangled belly fragments lie separated in distinct heaps upon the cloths, marking the first real division of the harvest. The tools are laid aside to cool, and the heavy fleeces rest in quiet disorder, holding within their tangled fibers the varied textures of the landscape from which they were drawn. The cool morning light filters through the high wooden shutters of the sorting loft, casting long, pale beams across heavy oak tables and benches. Here, away from the dust and noise of the open fold, the harvested fleeces are spread out for careful evaluation by hands trained through long apprenticeship. In pre-industrial European woolcraft, this sorting process was a critical juncture where the raw material was separated according to fiber length, fineness, strength, and cleanliness. Because no single universal grading chart existed across regions, specialized sorters relied on tactile memory and localized trade terminology to assess each fleece, determining which portions would serve for sturdy outer garments and which were better suited for fine, lightweight textiles. The anatomy of the sheep dictated the primary divisions of the fleece, as different parts of the animal's body produced fibers with vastly contrasting characteristics. The wool taken from the shoulders and upper sides of the animal was consistently recognized across many regional traditions as the highest grade, yielding uniform, elastic staples that responded well to drafting and spinning. Sorters gently lifted these prime locks, noting their spring and resilience under the palm of the hand. Moving down the flank toward the belly, the fiber typically grew shorter and carried a heavier accumulation of dust and vegetable matter picked up from low-lying brush. The breech wool, drawn from around the hind legs, presented an entirely different challenge. It was often coarser, longer, and heavily soiled with dried organic waste, requiring rigorous separation from the cleaner fleece components. Regional terminology reflected these physical distinctions, varying from one linguistic community to another, and changing over centuries of commercial textile development. In various English-speaking districts, handlers spoke of prime, seconds, and locks, while continental workshops in Flanders, Italy, or Castile utilized their own vernacular categories to designate fine merino-type growths, medium crossbred staples, and coarse hairy kemps. These grades were not merely technical descriptors, they directly dictated the economic value of the wool and shaped the calculations of merchants who traveled between rural collection points and urban manufacturing centers. A sack of sorted wool destined for a high-status urban guild in Florence required a very different standard of purity and fineness compared to coarse wool gathered for local peasant weaving in upland Scandinavian valleys. The intended cloth ultimately governed every decision made at the sorting table. If the wool was destined for the worsted pathway, where long fibers were kept parallel for a smooth, lustrous yarn, sorters meticulously pulled out any short, tangled locks that would disrupt the combing process. Conversely, if the fibers were marked for the woolen pathway, where a fuzzy, interlocking nap was desired for subsequent fulling, a wider range of staple lengths might be combined, provided the overall grease and dirt content could be managed during washing. Master sorters ran their fingers through the crimp of the wool, testing the natural wave and elasticity of the fiber. A tight, regular crimp indicated fine wool capable of holding extensive twist and shrinkage, while a flat, open staple signaled a coarser material better suited for heavy blankets or utilitarian outerwear. Labor organization during this sorting phase varied according to the scale of production and the prevailing economic framework. In smaller domestic households, women and men of the family shared the task of pulling apart the fleece, setting aside cleaner locks for immediate household spinning while bagging coarser fractions for trade or barter. In contrast, within major commercial centres such as the textile towns of 14th century Flanders or 15th century England, sorting was performed by full-time specialists operating under strict guild regulations or merchant oversight. These professional sorters worked in specialized warehouses or merchant halls, handling massive quantities of wool shipped downriver or across the sea. Their specialized judgment minimized waste during subsequent preparation stages, ensuring that spinners received material of consistent quality. Despite this professionalization, the work remained entirely dependent upon sensory perception and empirical skill, rather than precise measurement. Sorters worked in well-lit spaces, often near large windows facing north to avoid harsh, direct sunlight that could distort color and shadow. They turned the fleece over repeatedly, shaking out loose bits of soil, dried mud, and crushed bracken. Stray hairs, black fibers that would resist pale dyes, and rigid, hollow hemp fibers were carefully plucked out by hand and discarded. The air in the loft grew thick with the heavy scent of natural animal grease, dried sweat and field dust, settling in a fine film over the sorting benches and the clothing of the workers. The economic stakes of this sorting process were high, influencing the profit margins of rural landowners, urban syndicates, and merchant entrepreneurs alike. Guild statutes in many European cities penalized sorters who mixed inferior grades into top-tier bundles, reflecting the strong consumer protection and quality control enforced by civic authorities. Yet the ultimate quality of the cloth depended as much on the inherent properties of the sheep breed as on the human skill applied at the table. A coarse mountain breed could never be sorted into fine, draping cloth, just as a delicate lowland fleece would fail to produce a durable, wind-resistant sailcloth or heavy peasant mantle. To manage the wide divergence in staple types arriving from mixed herds, many larger rural manors and urban trading posts established designated sorting sheds where teams of workers processed hundreds of pounds of fleece daily. These workers maintained mental catalogues of regional wool variations, knowing precisely how wool from the limestone hills of the Cotswolds differed in elasticity and oil content from the fleeces of the Romney marshes or the mountain sheep of the Pyrenees. Such geographical awareness was vital because misclassifying a batch of wool could ruin an entire manufacturing run, rendering the spun yarn too weak for the warp threads of a loom or too coarse for the delicate finishing shears of the draper. Furthermore, the physical manipulation of the raw fleece required deliberate positioning to avoid damaging the delicate tips of the staples, which protected the internal structure of the fiber. Sorters used smooth wooden poles, or simply their bare hands, to turn the massive wool pokes inside out, emptying the contents onto the slatboards of the sorting table. As the layers parted, they revealed the complex topography of the harvest, ranging from the sun-bleached exterior tips that had weathered months of rain and wind, to the protected, creamy underfibers that had remained sealed against the animal's skin. Beyond structural integrity, sorting practitioners had to account for environmental contaminants that varied by terrain. Fleeces originating from wooded pastures contained high concentrations of leaf mold, splinters, and woody burrs, whereas open chalk downland produced wool burdened with fine, chalky dust that clung stubbornly to the root of the staple. Experienced workers used small combs and picking tools to dislodge stubborn particles without breaking or damaging the fibers. Each regional idiosyncrasy demanded a customized tactile response, illustrating why central oversight and standardized tools remained practically impossible across fragmented European production zones. As the morning hours advance, the tables become layered with neatly organized piles. The fine shoulder wool rests in compact, springy mounds, while the coarser breech locks and tangled belly fragments occupy separate baskets on the floor. Each graded pile still retains the heavy burden of natural suent and field debris, holding the environmental signature of the pastures where the sheep grazed. Selected locks, carrying their heavy coat of grease and trapped field debris, await the cleaning waters that will strip away the impurities, marking the transition from raw harvested fleece toward the disciplined preparations of the washhouse. The wooden vats and shallow stone troughs outside the washhouse stand ready as morning smoke rises from nearby hearths, where water heats over steady wood fires. Before wool could be drawn into yarn or shaped into cloth, the heavy burden of natural and environmental contamination had to be reduced. This cleaning process was a demanding physical necessity across pre-industrial Europe, yet it followed no single universal calendar or uniform method. In some regions and periods, fleeces were washed while still on the sheep's back, in shallow running streams days before shearing, while in others, the shearing was performed first, leaving the accumulated grease and dirt to be scoured from the sorted locks in dedicated washhouses or domestic yards. The substance requiring removal was a complex mixture of natural animal excretions and environmental debris. Chief among these was suint, a water-soluble potassium salt secreted by the sheep's sweat glands, combined with wool grease, commonly known as lanolin, which coated every individual fiber to protect the animal from rain and wind. While this natural grease was essential for keeping the living sheep dry in the pasture, it formed a sticky barrier that locked in fine dust, dried mud, vegetable burrs, and manure particles. Without reducing this greasy mantle, the fibers would remain matted, making subsequent combing, carding, and spinning exceptionally difficult, while also preventing dyes from penetrating the material evenly at a later stage. The approach to dissolving and washing away these elements varied according to local resources, available fuel, and the traditions of the manufacturing district. In water-abundant valleys, large wooden vats were filled with a mixture of cold stream water and heated spring water, carefully tempered so that the warmth would loosen the lanolin without scalding or shrinking the delicate protein structure of the wool. In other areas, particularly where firewood was scarce or fuel costs were high, workers relied more heavily on ambient water temperatures, extending the soaking time and relying on natural alkalinity to break down the grease. Laborers transported heavy wooden buckets of water from nearby rivers or wells, stoking hearths and maintaining steady supervision over the temperature of the vats through long, physically demanding hours. To aid in the scouring process, pre-industrial washers utilized various organic alkaline agents available within their immediate environment. In many rural communities, stale urine, valued for its natural ammonia content, was collected in household vessels and added to the wash vats to help cut through stubborn grease and soil. In other districts, potash extracted from wood ashes or specific alkaline earths gathered from local mineral deposits served a similar purpose. The choice of cleaning agent was rarely arbitrary. It was dictated by regional custom, the availability of supplies, and the specific sensitivity of the wool breed being processed. Coarse, hardy wools could withstand stronger alkaline solutions, whereas fine, delicate fleeces required gentler handling and more measured proportions of cleansing additives to preserve the elasticity and strength of the staple. The physical labor of washing required steady rhythm and endurance. Workers used long wooden paddles or stirred the submerged wool by hand, gently turning and pressing the locks to allow the warm, soapy liquid to circulate through the dense masses of fiber without felting or tangling the strands. As the water worked its way through the wool, it clouded into a thick, opaque grey mixture, laden with dirt and dissolved suint. The scoured locks were then lifted out using wooden forks or wicker baskets, allowing the dirty runoff to drain away before the wool was transferred to rinse tubs filled with clean, fresh water. The timing of this washing stage introduced significant variation across European manufacturing networks. In certain traditions, such as those practiced in specific English wool-producing manors, wool was washed immediately after shearing while still in large, unassorted fleeces, then laid out on clean grassy meadows or drying hurdles to bake in the sun and wind. In other regions, particularly where specialized sorting preceded preparation, the wool was graded first and only specific fractions, such as the fine shoulder locks destined for worsted spinning, were subjected to meticulous scouring, while coarser grades were washed later or processed with residual oils intact. This flexibility meant that merchants buying wool at regional fairs had to inspect the stock carefully to determine whether they were purchasing greasy wool or washed fiber, as the difference in weight and cleanliness directly affected the price and subsequent handling requirements. The environmental impact of these washing operations was managed through local custom and topography, rather than formal regulation. Washhouses were typically situated near fast-flowing streams or rivers, capable of carrying away the turbid runoff downstream, while avoiding stagnation near human habitations. The strong, pungent scent of wet wool, warm suint, and alkaline additives hung heavily in the moist air around the vats, marking the landscape as clearly as the sound of splashing water and the rhythmic thud of wooden paddles against the sides of the tubs. Beyond general scouring practices, master washers had to account for the specific mineral content of local water sources. Hard waters rich in calcium and magnesium salts reacted poorly with natural soaps and alkaline additives, forming insoluble curds that clung stubbornly to the wool fibers and interfered with later processing. To counteract this, workshops situated near hard-water springs often constructed settling basins or relied exclusively on captured rainwater for the final rinsing stages, ensuring that the cleaned wool remained soft and receptive to subsequent treatments. Furthermore, the drying process required careful oversight to prevent atmospheric contamination. If the wet wool was spread across grassy fields that had not been properly cleared, stray grass seeds, clover heads, and wind-blown chaff became embedded in the damp, open staples, creating extra labor for the pickers and carders who followed. Consequently, many production sites utilized elevated wicker hurdles or clean stone terraces where the wool could dry rapidly under the influence of sun and air, without picking up unwanted vegetable debris from the ground. In maritime communities and coastal districts, specialized drying frames were constructed facing prevailing sea winds, allowing steady air currents to pass freely beneath the suspended fleeces. This accelerated moisture evaporation without requiring artificial heat sources, which ran the risk of scorching the protein strands if temperature regulation faltered. The careful balance between natural air drying and thermal protection reflected centuries of empirical observation passed down among cottage workers and estate overseers alike. Despite the thoroughness of these washhouses, the cleaning process was rarely absolute. Traces of natural oil and minor bits of stubborn vegetable matter invariably remained trapped deep within the heart of the locks. Furthermore, the act of washing and drying left the wool fibers tightly packed and interlocked, forming dense, damp clumps that had to be carefully opened before any spinning could take place. The wet fibers, having absorbed significant moisture during their immersion, required careful drying on clean canvas sheets, wicker racks, or sun-bleached turf slopes, where gentle breezes and natural warmth restored their spring without exposing them to damaging heat. As the sun climbs higher and the drying racks fill with clean, pale locks that begin to lose their heavy dampness, the physical reality of the fiber changes once again. The greasy, compacted mass that arrived from the sorting tables has been lightened and relaxed, yet the individual fibers remain intertwined and locked together in dense, irregular clusters. Before these clean strands can be drawn into smooth yarns or prepared for the spindle, they must be teased apart, opened up, and relieved of any remaining microscopic debris. The clean fiber rests quietly in the warm air, awaiting the tools and gentle motions that will open its structure to the wind. The morning sunlight slants across the workshop floor where the dried, washed locks rest in quiet heaps, their natural oils partially reduced, but their fibers still tightly bound in dense clusters. Before the wool could be subjected to the fine alignment of carding or combing, it required an intermediate mechanical loosening to shatter remaining clumps and dislodge stubborn fragments of straw, burrs, and sand. Across pre-industrial Europe, this opening phase, variously known as teasing, picking, or willowing, was a fundamental step that bridged the gap between raw washing and final yarn preparation. Yet this work followed no mandatory universal sequence or uniform tooling. Methods varied significantly by region, workshop scale, and the specific demands of the local textile tradition. In many domestic settings, this opening labor was performed entirely by hand, relying on fingers and simple wooden boards to pull apart the matted locks. Workers sat beside baskets of clean wool, taking small clusters of fibers and gently teasing them open to inspect the interior for trapped debris. This hand-picking was painstaking and repetitive, demanding steady patience rather than complex machinery. Working in domestic kitchens, cottage corners, or dedicated workrooms, family members or hired assistants plucked out stray bits of dried bracken, thistle heads, and dark guard hairs that had resisted the wash vats. The pace was governed by human endurance and the physical layout of the room, with natural light guiding the search for microscopic imperfections that would otherwise blemish the spun yarn. In other regions and later medieval periods, particularly where workshops scaled up to handle larger commercial volumes, mechanical aids began to supplement or replace simple hand-pulling. Among these tools was the willow, a cage-like drum or frame strung with cords or wire mesh upon which the wool was beaten. By striking the wool against these taut cords or manipulating it within a suspended cage, workers forced trapped dust, sand, and brittle vegetable matter to fall through the mesh while opening the fiber clusters without cutting the staples. In some continental and English districts, specialized beating poles or light switches were used to whip the wool spread across hurdle frames, creating a rhythmic, echoing sound that marked the transition of the fiber from a matted mass to an airy, voluminous cloud. Another notable instrument found in various forms across different European traditions was the bow, an elastic wooden arch strung with a tightly tensioned cord of gut or catgut. The operator held the bow so that the vibrating string rested within a basket or heap of wool, then plucked or struck the cord with a small wooden mallet. The rapid vibration of the string sent gentle shock waves through the fleece, snapping apart intertwined locks and lifting the fibers into a light, uniform fluff without damaging their internal structure. This technique, though requiring precise dexterity and rhythm, offered a remarkably efficient way to open tightly packed wools without the heavy physical strain associated with prolonged hand pulling. The organization of this labor reflected the wider economic arrangements of the surrounding community. In smallholder households, picking and teasing were integrated into the shared domestic routine, often performed during communal evening gatherings or by younger hands learning the foundational tactile qualities of the fiber. In contrast, within the merchant-controlled workshops of major manufacturing centers, such as those in northern Italy or the Low Countries, specialized laborers, often working under wage arrangements or piece rates, carried out these opening stages in dedicated sheds before the wool was distributed to spinners. These workers developed an intuitive feel for the density of different regional clips, knowing instantly whether a particular fleece required aggressive beating on a willow frame or gentle manual teasing to protect delicate fibers. The choice of method was intimately tied to the ultimate destiny of the yarn. Wool designated for the worsted pathway, which required long, parallel fibers, needed careful handling during this opening stage to avoid breaking or scrambling the delicate staples. Teasing for worsted preparation focused on untangling the locks while preserving their full length, ensuring that the subsequent combing process would encounter straight, orderly fibers. Conversely, wool destined for the woolen pathway, where a tangled, interlocking web was actually desirable for fulling, could withstand more vigorous teasing and opening without compromising the final texture of the cloth. Environmental factors also influenced how the wool was treated on the workshop floor. In damp coastal regions, or during the heavy moisture of autumn and winter, dried wool had a tendency to reabsorb ambient humidity, causing the fibers to cling together stubbornly. Workshops in such climates often utilized simple charcoal braziers or hearth warmth to gently condition the wool before picking, ensuring the dry fibers separated readily under the fingers or tools. Conversely, in dry interior regions, static electricity could cause fine fibers to fly about the room, prompting workers to lightly dampen their hands or sprinkle the floor to keep the loose wool manageable. Beyond basic manual pulling and basket shaking, specialized local practices emerged to handle particularly stubborn contaminants. In regions where sheep grazed heavily forested commons, the wool frequently accumulated sticky pine resins and crushed woody galls that defied ordinary washing and picking. Workers in these timber-rich districts employed small, flat wooden boards studded with blunt wooden pegs or animal bone teeth, dragging the wool across these makeshift hackles to catch adhesive resins before the main spinning preparation. This intermediate grooming step protected subsequent iron combs and wire cards from gumming up with resinous buildup. Furthermore, the scale of regional output dictated whether picking was decentralized among individual cottagers or centralized in urban wool halls. In centralized urban environments, master craftsmen maintained strict quality benchmarks, penalizing workers whose picked wool still contained hidden burrs or kemp hairs that could compromise the surface of dyed fabrics. Apprentices spent weeks learning the exact angle at which to pull a lock so that the staple split cleanly along its natural growth lines rather than snapping in the middle. To maintain consistency across varied batches, master artisans frequently inspected the opened wool by handfuls, feeling for residual moisture pockets or compacted clumps that might jam hand combs or carding teeth. In municipal centers of Northern Europe, sworn guild inspectors occasionally visited domestic workrooms to ensure that the picking phase had been executed thoroughly, penalizing households that attempted to spin wool containing excessive vegetable waste. This regulatory oversight reinforced the divide between raw preparation and the precise alignments required for spinning. The air in the workshop during these hours was filled with a fine, floating dust of microscopic vegetable chaff and loose wool down, settling gently upon the wooden benches and the clothing of the laborers. The pungent scent of natural lanolin, though reduced by earlier washing, still lingered as the mechanical action of the willow or the bow released fresh layers of fiber to the air. The heavy, compacted masses of washed wool were gradually transformed into vast, billowy heaps of soft, receptive material that filled the corners of the room. As the physical labor of teasing and picking draws to a close, the pile of open, clean wool rests in a state of delicate equilibrium. The dense knots have been shattered, the foreign debris cleared, and the individual staples liberated from their tangled bonds. Yet this airy cloud of fiber holds within it a fundamental divergence of purpose. The pathways of preparation now split definitively, demanding that the loosened strands be directed either toward the aligned discipline of the comb or the random web of the card, setting the stage for the distinct crafts of worsted and woolen spinning. The workshop floor shifts in atmosphere as the loose cloud of prepared wool approaches the benches where wooden handcards and long-toothed iron combs rest side by side. Across pre-industrial Europe, this juncture represented one of the most critical structural divides in textile production, shaping whether the resulting cloth would emerge as a soft, napped woolen or a smooth, lustrous worsted. Yet this distinction was rarely an absolute binary. Rather, it formed a continuous spectrum of fiber manipulation, governed by staple length, breed characteristics, local guild traditions, and the intended weight and drape of the finished textile. The first of these two primary pathways relied upon handcards, tools designed to distribute fibers into a random airy web. A pair of handcards consisted of flat wooden paddles backed with leather, through which hundreds of fine, angled wire or bent iron teeth had been punched. The operator held one card steady across the knee while drawing the opposing card smoothly through the cloud of wool, catching and opening the individual staples. By moving the cards against one another, the fibers were teased into all possible directions, crossing over each other to form a delicate, multi-directional web. This random arrangement captured microscopic pockets of air, giving the carded bat or roll a soft, spongy volume that was ideally suited for trapping warmth and holding the dense, interlocking nap characteristic of traditional woolens. Carding was well suited for shorter, finer, or crimpier wool staples that lacked the uniform length required for smooth alignment. In many domestic and rural settings throughout the medieval and early modern periods, carding was a ubiquitous household task, performed by family members sitting near hearths during the darker months of the year. The rhythmic scraping of wire teeth against leather filled the room with a steady, soothing sound, accompanied by the gentle scent of residual lanolin and clean wood. Once the wool had been passed repeatedly between the cards, it was gently rolled off the surface into a loose cylinder or rollage, ready for woolen spinning with a comparatively open, airy arrangement. In contrast, the second pathway, combing, pursued an entirely different structural goal: absolute parallelism. Combers worked with long, lustrous wool staples, utilizing heavy iron-toothed combs mounted on sturdy wooden posts or held firmly in the lap. These combs featured multiple rows of long, needle-sharp steel tines projecting from a solid wooden block. Before combing could begin, the wool was often anointed with a small quantity of vegetable oil or animal fat, such as olive oil or butter, to lubricate the long staples and reduce friction as the metal teeth passed through the mass. The comber drew one heated comb through another in a sweeping, mechanical motion, transferring the wool back and forth until every single fiber lay straight, smooth, and parallel to its neighbors. This process separated the long, strong staples, known in many English and continental traditions as the top, from the shorter, tangled fibers left behind in the teeth, which were gathered up as knäuel. While the top was carefully drawn off into smooth, ribbon-like slivers ready for worsted spinning, the knäuel was rarely wasted. It was frequently diverted back into the carded woolen stream to be spun into sturdier, lower-cost yarns. Combing demanded considerable physical strength, specialized endurance, and precise skill, as working with heated iron combs over open charcoal pots required careful temperature control to avoid scorching the delicate protein strands. Consequently, combing was frequently carried out by specialized male artisans working in dedicated workshops rather than casual domestic spinners. The organizational structure surrounding these two preparation methods reflected distinct economic networks. Carding equipment was inexpensive and compact, easily produced by local carpenters and leatherworkers, making it a staple of decentralized cottage industries and smallholder homesteads where cloth was produced for family use or local exchange. Combing equipment, by contrast, involved heavy forged iron tines and specialized stabilizing furniture, and the process required sustained physical exertion and specific technical training, often regulated by urban guild statutes. Merchant capitalists operating putting-out systems frequently distributed raw, washed wool to specialized combers in urban workshops, before forwarding the smooth slivers to rural spinners scattered across surrounding parishes. The choice between carding and combing was fundamentally dictated by the inherent characteristics of the sheep's fleece. Long wool breeds, such as those grazed in the marshlands of Romney or certain lowland districts of Flanders and England, yielded staples that could easily exceed several inches in length, making them natural candidates for the comb. These long, parallel worsted yarns produced lightweight, tightly woven fabrics that showed off a clean weave structure and resisted wear without requiring a heavy felted surface. Conversely, Short wool breeds from upland pastures or rocky hillsides produced shorter, highly crimped staples that defied parallel alignment but excelled when carded into a lofty, entangling web that would later swell and felt during the fulling process. Beyond structural mechanics and regional breed differences, workshop hygiene and tool maintenance played a daily role in the preparation cycle. Carding paddles required frequent cleaning to remove impacted grease and short fiber residue that accumulated at the base of the wire teeth, often accomplished using small wooden cleaning combs or specialized wire brushes. Similarly, the iron tines of combing posts had to be polished with fine sand and oil to prevent rust from forming in the damp air of rural workshops, ensuring that the smooth metal surface would not snag or tear the long worsted staples during transfer. Furthermore, environmental conditions within the workspace directly influenced the behavior of the fibers during both carding and combing. In dry, heated rooms, static electricity caused fine carded wool to cling stubbornly to the leather backing of the paddles, making it difficult to roll off clean bats. Workers countered this by lightly misting the air or maintaining small pots of steaming water near the workbenches, adding subtle humidity that relaxed the static charge without dampening the staple structure. In contrast, heavy atmospheric moisture required comb hearths to burn hotter, keeping the iron tines warm so that they glided effortlessly through oil-lubricated locks. In addition to thermal regulation at the comb hearth, master craftsmen evaluated the ambient draft of the room to ensure that fine stray fibers did not drift into neighboring workspaces or settle upon finished yarn stock. Enclosed workshops often utilized heavy wooden screens or leather partitions to isolate the dusty, oil-laden atmosphere of the combing bench from the cleaner areas where spun yarn was stored. This spatial division protected the integrity of the materials and maintained a clear boundary between greasy preparation and clean spinning activities. Despite these clear technical divergences, regional workshops frequently blurred the boundaries depending on local market demands and fiber availability. In some districts, hybrid preparation methods emerged where workers lightly carded wool that had already undergone preliminary sorting, or combined combed slivers with carded bats to create specialized intermediate yarns that possessed both strength and softness. These flexible practices underscore the adaptability of pre-industrial textile workers, who modified their tools and techniques to suit the variable yields of seasonal shearings and the specific preferences of local clothiers. As the work progresses through the afternoon, the workshop benches display the distinct results of both pathways. On one side rest soft, fluffy rolls of carded wool, their random webs holding air like spun cloud, while on the other lie sleek, ordered bundles of combed top, their long fibers gleaming with a quiet, oily luster. The dust settles, the rhythmic scrape of wire and the heavy clang of iron combs fade into silence, and the prepared fibers rest quietly in their respective baskets. Each strand, whether caught in a multi-directional web or smoothed into strict parallelism, awaits the draft and twist that will transform it into yarn. The quiet interior of the cottage or workshop settles into a steady, rhythmic cadence as the prepared fibers are drawn from their baskets toward the spindle. Across pre-industrial Europe, the hand spindle remained an enduring, ubiquitous tool for transforming loose carded rolls or combed slivers into coherent yarn. Long before mechanized frames altered the landscape of production, the combination of a weighted spindle and a handheld distaff anchored the daily labor of countless households. This ancient method of drafting and twisting was far from primitive. It required precise muscular control, acute tactile judgment, and an intimate knowledge of how fiber tension translated into uniform yarn strength. The process relied upon two fundamental actions working in concert: drafting, which pulled out a small stream of fibers from the supply, and twisting, which locked those fibers together into a continuous strand. The spinner typically secured the prepared wool to a distaff, a wooden shaft held under the arm, tucked into a belt, or mounted upright on a floor stand. The distaff kept the loose wool elevated, clean, and organized, allowing the spinner's fingers to draw out a minute, even stream of fibers without interference from stray locks. As the fibers were drawn out between the thumb and forefinger of one hand, the spinning hand set a weighted shaft, known as the spindle, into motion. The spindle itself was a simple tool composed of a straight wooden shaft fitted with a haul, a small disc of clay, bone, wood, or stone that acted as a flywheel to maintain momentum. When the spinner twirled the shaft against a knee or let it dangle freely in the air, the rapid rotation imparted twist into the newly drafted fibers. As the twist climbed up the slender column of wool, it converted the loose cloud into a strong, cohesive thread. Once sufficient twist had accumulated in a short section, the spinner halted the rotation, wound the newly formed length of yarn around the lower portion of the spindle shaft, and secured it with a temporary half-hitch or notch known as a whorl hitch, creating a compact, conical package of yarn called a cop. This handheld technique persisted across centuries and regions, coexisting with and often outlasting early mechanical innovations because of its remarkable portability and low cost. A hand spindle could be carried anywhere, tucked into an apron pocket, or held in the hand while walking between fields, tending livestock, or sitting outside cottage thresholds during long summer evenings. This portability deeply shaped the organization of domestic labor. In many rural communities, spinning was an interstitial activity, seamlessly integrated into the cracks of daily life. Women, children, and elderly household members filled moments between agricultural chores, cooking, and childminding by drafting yarn from the distaff, turning marginal time into essential economic output. Yet this domestic integration varied significantly by social structure, regional wealth, and market demand. In smallholder peasant households, hand-spun yarn was produced primarily to meet immediate family needs, supplying the domestic loom with warp and weft for everyday garments. In other regions, particularly by the later medieval and early modern eras, spinning became part of extensive merchant-driven putting-out systems. Urban drapers and merchant capitalists distributed prepared wool to rural cottages, collecting the spun cops at regular intervals to feed expanding urban weaving workshops. In these commercial networks, spinning was often performed under strict piece rate agreements, where the regularity, weight, and twist of the yarn were closely scrutinized by merchant agents. The gendered division of this labor was pronounced across most European societies, though it was rarely absolute. While men frequently dominated heavy tasks such as sheep shearing, wool combing, and fulling, spinning with the distaff and spindle was overwhelmingly performed by women. This association was so deep-seated that in various regional legal codes and cultural traditions, the term spinster became synonymous with an unmarried woman, reflecting the economic reality that independent female wage earning was frequently tied to the production of yarn. Despite its low economic status within commercial hierarchies, where spinners generally received the lowest wages in the textile chain, the sheer volume of labor required meant that the entire pre-industrial cloth economy depended fundamentally on the tireless output of these domestic workers. The physical mechanics of hand spinning demanded constant adjustment based on whether the wool had been carded or combed. Carded wool, with its random lofty web, was often spun from a rowlag using a woolen or long draw, producing a soft yarn with an airy structure. Combed wool, by contrast, was drawn from a smooth sliver held firmly on the distaff, producing a worsted yarn where the parallel fibers created a tight, smooth, and lustrous thread. Spinners developed an intuitive feel for these variations through years of practice, adjusting the speed of the spindle rotation and the rate of fiber draft to maintain a consistent diameter across hundreds of yards of thread. In regions where specialized breeds produced long staple, lustrous wool, spinners often utilized a slightly longer spindle shaft to allow for a greater accumulation of yarn before winding the cop. The weight of the whorl was also calibrated to the type of fiber. A heavy whorl was necessary for spinning coarse, thick wool into strong yarn for blankets, while a small, light whorl allowed the spinner to maintain the high-speed, delicate control required for fine worsted threads. Such tools were often passed down through generations, with individual spinners developing specific preferences for the weight and balance of their personal spindles. Furthermore, the environment in which spinning took place, whether in a drafty barn or a humid, sheltered cellar, directly influenced the fiber's handling. In colder climates, spinners often warmed their wool near a hearth to ensure the natural oils remained supple, preventing the fiber from becoming brittle during drafting. Conversely, in warm or exceptionally dry environments, the fiber might become too lively and prone to snapping, necessitating a light, controlled application of moisture to the spinner's fingers to keep the drafting stream consistent. These subtle environmental adjustments highlight the deep empirical knowledge embedded in pre-industrial spinning. Beyond these mechanical considerations, the management of the distaff itself was an art of efficiency. A well-dressed distaff, loaded with just the right quantity of fiber, ensured that the spinner did not have to stop frequently to reload. Experienced workers learned to build a conical crown of wool atop the distaff that fed smoothly and evenly, preventing the fiber from tangling or dropping in clusters. This preparation minimized the time spent on non-productive tasks, maximizing the number of cops completed during a work session. As the work continued through the shifting daylight, the rhythm of the spinning hand became automatic, a continuous cycle of draft, twist, wind, and secure. The basket of prepared wool gradually diminished as neat, tapered cops accumulated on the spindle shafts, swelling into dense little packages of grey, brown, or creamy white yarn. The motion remained grounded in human touch and gravity, requiring no complex gearing or external power sources. Yet across various workshops and trading districts, the desire for greater output and more continuous operation began to prompt subtle shifts in technique. The steady, vertical drop of the hand spindle started to find competition in horizontal momentum as wooden wheels and rotating spindles were introduced to accelerate the twist and transform the cadence of the craft. The gentle hum of the spindle shaft turning against the fingers begins to pick up a subtle momentum as hands grow more swift and practiced. The simple wooden drop weight yields to the pull of new apparatuses, and the steady, solitary rotation of the hanging spindle shifts toward a faster, more continuous revolution driven by the rising presence of the spinning wheel. The steady hum of the traditional drop spindle was gradually accompanied, over centuries of uneven adoption across pre-industrial Europe, by the turning mechanics of the spinning wheel. This technological shift did not arrive as a sudden universal revolution that swept away hand spindles overnight. Instead, the introduction of wheel-driven spinning was marked by slow, regional diffusion, varied mechanical forms, and a prolonged coexistence between older and newer methods of drafting and twisting fiber. From the high wheel designs utilized for woolen yarn to the flyer and bobbins mechanisms associated with continuous treadle operation, the spinning wheel reshaped workshop rhythms without instantly replacing the familiar, portable drop spindle. Chronologically, the appearance of spinning wheels in European visual art, municipal records, and guild statutes unfolded across the later medieval centuries, yet their spread varied wildly by geography and local economic structures. In some urban textile centers of Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries, mechanical spinning devices appeared in workshops by the 13th and 14th centuries, while remote rural districts, upland sheep farming communities, and smaller domestic households continued to rely predominantly on the hand spindle well into the early modern era. The adoption of a wheel was a significant capital investment for a peasant family or small-scale artisan, requiring the craftsmanship of a local woodturner or joiner to fashion wheels, spindles, and framing timbers that remained true through thousands of rotations. Two distinct mechanical traditions emerged across pre-industrial Europe, each tailored to different fiber preparations and yarn types. The great wheel, sometimes called the walking wheel or wool wheel, was designed primarily for spinning short staple-carded wool. Standing several feet high, this wheel was turned by hand using a wooden peg or crank, driving a small spindle via a continuous cord. The spinner walked back and forth or stood beside the frame, drafting out a long length of carded rowlag with one hand while turning the large wheel with the other, then winding the resulting yarn onto the spindle by walking forward as the wheel turned in reverse. This method required considerable physical coordination and space, making it a fixture of larger cottage workrooms or specialized spinning sheds, rather than cramped urban tenements. In contrast, the treadle-operated wheel, often featuring a flyer mechanism, provided a continuous dual-action system where drafting, twisting, and winding occurred simultaneously without stopping the rotation. Driven by a foot pedal connected to a crankshaft, the treadle wheel freed both of the spinner's hands to draft the fiber stream into the orifice and onto the bobbin. This design was particularly favored for spinning prepared worsted yarns or fine fibers, where consistent tension and high twist rates were essential. Yet, even where treadle wheels were introduced, their presence did not spell the immediate extinction of the hand spindle. Many households maintained both tools side by side, deploying the hand spindle for quick, casual spinning, while reserving the wheel for larger commercial quotas or specific yarn weights. The organization of labor surrounding the spinning wheel reflected the broader commercial networks of the putting-out system. As merchant capitalists sought to increase yarn output to feed growing urban weaving sectors, they frequently financed the distribution of spinning wheels to rural cottagers, or stipulated in contracts that workers must adopt wheel-based production to meet stricter delivery deadlines. In regions dominated by guild regulations, municipal authorities occasionally debated the quality of yarn produced by wheels compared to hand spindles, fearing that the increased speed of mechanical twisting might lead to uneven yarn diameter or compromised strength. Consequently, guild statutes in certain towns specified whether wheel-spun yarn was permissible for particular grades of cloth, illustrating the cautious, conservative approach communities took toward new manufacturing tools. Gender dynamics in spinning also adjusted around these new apparatuses, though the craft remained overwhelmingly associated with female labor. While operating a great wheel demanded a standing posture and active physical movement across the floor, the treadle wheel allowed the spinner to sit for extended periods, altering the posture of domestic work. In many cottage settings, Older women or younger daughters operated the treadles while managing other household responsibilities, integrating the steady whir of the wooden wheel into the daily routine of the hearth and kitchen. Despite the higher output achievable with a wheel, the piece rate wages paid by merchants to spinners remained notoriously modest, ensuring that the economic reality of the work stayed demanding regardless of the mechanical assistance employed. The environment of the spinning room shifted with the arrival of these wooden machines. The silent drop of the hanging spindle was replaced by the low, resonant thrum of large wooden rims turning on iron axes, the light slap of drive bands joining wheel to spindle haul, and the soft scuffle of footsteps beside the great wheel. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax or tallow used to lubricate wooden bearings and axles to prevent squeaking during long hours of operation. Baskets of carded rollags and combed slivers steadily emptied as the continuous rotation of the wheel drew the fibers inward, transforming fluffy bats into tightly wound bobbins and cops of uniform yarn. Beyond the immediate workshop floor, the spread of spinning wheels fostered specialized local woodworking trades dedicated to producing replacement parts. Because drive bands wore down quickly under friction and wooden spindles required precise balance to prevent vibration, local turners crafted interchangeable bobbins and balanced wheel rims from seasoned ash, maple or beech wood. These components had to be fitted carefully by hand, as minor imperfections in the turning of a flyer arm could cause the yarn to catch or snap during high-speed rotation. Furthermore, the maintenance of uniform tension across the flyer and bobbin assembly required spinners to understand the differential pull between the bobbin and the whirl. Instructed by mothers or experienced peers, younger workers learnt to adjust the tension pegs or breaking strings that regulated how rapidly the bobbin drew in the newly twisted thread. This mechanical intuition prevented the yarn from stretching out of shape or backing up into awkward tangles on the wooden frame, ensuring that the output remained smooth enough for the loom. In regions where textile production was heavily commercialized, merchant networks occasionally supplied standardized wheels to ensure that the yarn returned from different cottages possessed a uniform twist angle. If a spinner's wheel was out of alignment, the resulting yarn could prove too slack for warp threads, leading to rejections upon inspection at the urban cloth hall. Thus, the physical integrity of the wheel itself became an indirect subject of quality control managed by merchant overseers and village elders alike. Yet, whether spun on a hanging drop spindle or drawn through the flyer of a treadle wheel, the freshly produced yarn was still in a raw, unstable state. The newly twisted fibers possessed a lively, elastic tension that required careful setting, measuring, and organization before the thread could be entrusted to the stresses of the loom. Cops and bobbins accumulated in wooden sorting bins, representing weeks of steady draft and twist across diverse households and workshops. Before these scattered lengths could become part of a woven textile, they had to be gathered from their various spindles, wound into standardized skeins, and subjected to the meticulous processes of sizing and warping that prepared the yarn for the web. The steady whir of the spinning wheel begins to slow as the bobbins fill to their edges, and the last lengths of loose fiber are drawn through the orifice. The accumulated yarn rests in quiet heaps of cops and spools across the workshop benches, holding the tension of the twist within every strand. The task of spinning gives way to the precise geometry of measurement, as the finished threads must now be reeled, measured, counted, and ordered into the rigid alignment required to form the warp of the loom. The workshop benches are cleared of loose fiber, as the scattered cops, bobbins, and spindles of spun yarn are brought together for measurement and organization. Across pre-industrial Europe, transforming individual lengths of spun thread into a coherent woven fabric required a meticulous intermediate stage of counting, winding, and warping. This process was far from uniform. Local measurement units varied from village to village, and the coordination required to assemble hundreds of individual threads linked households, specialist winders, and weavers in complex webs of mutual obligation. Before a single thread could be mounted onto a loom, the yarn had to be drawn from its initial spindle packages, structured into standard skeins, treated for strength, and arranged in strict parallel alignment. The first task in this sequence was winding the yarn from cops or bobbins into skeins or hanks, using simple hand-turned reels or rotating swift frames. This step served a dual purpose. It relieved the internal twist tension locked within the newly spun thread, while allowing the worker to count and measure the total length of the yarn. Measuring devices varied widely across regions, ranging from simple wooden wall pegs or notched boards to rotating reel frames equipped with audible clicking devices that sounded at preset intervals to mark specific lengths. Because pre-industrial Europe lacked a universal standard of measurement, each textile district relied on its own customary units of length and count, recorded in guild books or passed down through trade practice. A skein counted in a Yorkshire village followed different numerical tallies from one wound in a Flemish town or a Tuscan workshop. Once wound into skeins, the yarn often required sizing or starching to strengthen the threads against the mechanical friction of the loom. Sizing mixtures were prepared from organic starches such as barley flour, rye meal, or animal glues boiled down in small pots over hearth fires. Workers gently immersed the skeins into the warm sizing solution, ensuring that every strand absorbed a protective coating before being hung out on wooden poles to dry. This sizing stiffened the yarn slightly and glued down stray protruding fibers, preventing the threads from fraying or snapping when the rigid heddles and batten of the loom moved back and forth during weaving. The choice of sizing ingredient depended heavily on local agricultural output, utilizing whatever grain or starch residue was readily available in the domestic or regional economy. Following sizing and drying, the yarn was ready for the complex geometric operation of warping, the creation of the parallel array of lengthwise threads that would form the foundation of the web. Warping required a dedicated wooden warping frame, pegboard, or revolving creel mounted against a wall or floor. The worker took the ends of several threads from different skeins and walked back and forth across the frame, crossing the strands in a precise figure-8 pattern known as the cross or lease. This cross was vital because it maintained the exact sequence and orientation of every single thread, preventing the long array from tangling before it could be transferred to the loom beam. The labor organization behind this preparatory work reflected the dispersed and collaborative nature of pre-industrial textile production. In many cottage environments, women and children handled the winding and measuring alongside spinning duties, preparing small warps for domestic handlooms. In commercial putting-out networks, however, specialized winders and warpers often performed these tasks in separate workshops under contract to merchant drapers. Because the warp threads had to endure far more mechanical stress on the loom than the weft, warping demanded exceptional care and accuracy. Miscounting the threads or introducing uneven tension during warping resulted in a flawed web, leading to rejections and financial penalties when the finished cloth was inspected. Environmental conditions within the workspace also influenced how the yarn behaved during warping. Dry indoor air caused fine woolen threads to become brittle and prone to snapping under tension, prompting workers to sprinkle water on the floor or work during more humid morning hours. Conversely, excessive dampness could cause sized yarn to stick together awkwardly on the frame. Warpers relied on tactile feedback, running their fingers lightly across the taut array of threads to detect weak spots or loose tensions before winding the finished warp into a compact chain for transport to the weaver. The scale of a warp varied according to the type of loom it was intended for and the breadth of cloth desired. A narrow peasant loom producing simple household cloth required a relatively short warp with modest thread counts, whereas wide commercial looms in urban workshops demanded massive, meticulously organized warps comprising hundreds or even thousands of individual threads spanning many yards in length. Assembling such a large warp required hours of patient pacing back and forth across the frame, keeping the rhythmic count unbroken amid the ambient noise of the household or workshop. Beyond the basic mechanics of framing and measuring, the handling of multicolored yarns introduced additional complexity to the warping process. When weavers planned striped or checked patterns, warpers had to sequence different hanks of dyed yarn with absolute precision, tracking color rotations across the entire width of the frame without relying on written charts. This mental bookkeeping required seasoned familiarity with local design traditions, ensuring that the resulting fabric matched the expectations of rural buyers or urban merchants who commissioned specific regional styles. Furthermore, the tools themselves reflected local woodworking traditions and workshop constraints. While upright pegboards were common in cramped domestic spaces, where wall space was at a premium, larger commercial warping frames often took the form of massive rotating reels mounted on heavy floor trestles. These large frames allowed a single worker to wind exceptionally long warps by turning a crank handle, systematically layering the threads across wooden arms before chaining the completed length off the pegs. Maintaining the structural integrity of these wooden frames required occasional waxing and tightening of joints to prevent warping under the cumulative tension of hundreds of tightly pulled threads. To ensure compliance with local merchant standards, civic inspectors in major textile towns occasionally audited the length of commercial skeins using standardized brass measuring rods kept at the guild hall. Discrepancies between rural counts and urban expectations could result in confiscated yarn or docked payments, heightening the care with which winders recorded their tallies. In addition to length verification, master artisans often monitored the moisture retention of sized hanks before assembly. If the sizing paste contained too much water when the yarn was wound onto the warping frame, Subsequent drying caused the parallel strands to bond together into rigid sheets that resisted proper separation during beam mounting. Warpers therefore tested the pliability of the dried threads by hand, ensuring each strand flexed independently before final chain-making commenced. As the warping operation drew to its final stages, the worker carefully gathered the long chain of threads, securing the lease crosses with heavy twine to ensure the sequence remained intact during handling. This folded chain was then coiled or packed into baskets, ready for the short journey from the winding room to the weaver's bench. The diverse strands of yarn, once scattered across numerous spindles and bobbins in different homes, had been unified into a single, predictable geometric blueprint. The atmosphere settles as the final crosses are secured with stout cords, and the completed warp is carefully bundled, lifted from the frame, and prepared for transport. The loose chaos of countless individual cops and bobbins has been disciplined into a single, orderly sequence of parallel threads, measured and sized for the stresses ahead. The bundled warp leaves the winding tables behind, moving forward to meet the wooden frame of a loom suited to its specific time, place, and craft tradition. The bundled warp arrives from the winding rooms and is brought before the timber frame of the loom, where centuries of hand-weaving traditions find their physical expression. Across pre-industrial Europe, the loom was never a single universal machine subject to linear, inevitable progress. Instead, different regional cultures, time periods, and workshop settings utilized a diverse array of weaving apparatuses, ranging from the ancient warp-weighted loom and the vertical two-beam loom to the horizontal treadle loom equipped with harnesses and flying shuttles. Each configuration imposed its own mechanical logic upon the craft, shaping the posture of the artisan, the rhythm of construction, and the structural properties of the resulting cloth. In early medieval domestic contexts and specific upland or traditional districts, the warp-weighted loom maintained a stubborn and enduring presence. Constructed as an upright wooden frame leaning gently against a wall, this loom suspended the warp threads vertically from a top beam, keeping them under tension through heavy stones or ceramic weights tied in clusters along the lower ends. The weaver walked back and forth across the front of the frame, lifting specific warp threads by hand or using a shedding sword to create the opening through which the weft was passed. This vertical arrangement allowed the woven cloth to grow downward from the top beam, creating dense, heavy woolens ideal for protective mantles and utilitarian peasant garments. Parallel to, and eventually overlapping with vertical traditions, the two-beam horizontal loom emerged across many continental and island workshops. In this setup, both the warp beam and the cloth beam were mounted horizontally within a sturdy trestle frame, allowing the weaver to sit on a bench before the work. The warp threads stretched flatly across the space between the beams, maintained under tension by pawls and ratchet wheels. This horizontal posture altered the physical demands of labor, distributing body weight across a seated bench and enabling longer, uninterrupted hours of rhythmic work. By the later medieval and early modern periods, the horizontal treadle loom became the dominant fixture in urban guild workshops and specialized rural weaving sheds. Connected to foot-operated pedals or treadles positioned near the base of the frame, the harness system lifted and lowered alternate sets of warp threads automatically, opening a clean shed with each depression of the foot. This mechanical linkage freed both hands of the weaver to manage the shuttle carrying the weft yarn across the width of the web. The wooden shuttle, often tipped with iron and loaded with a small pern of yarn, was passed smoothly from hand to hand or thrown rapidly through the open shed, creating a steady, echoing clatter that defined the auditory landscape of the weaving room. The process of weaving on these diverse wooden frames followed a repeating mechanical sequence: shedding, picking, and beating. First, the movement of the harnesses created the shed, separating the warp threads into upper and lower layers. Second, the shuttle was passed through this opening, laying down a single pick of weft yarn perpendicular to the warp. Third, the heavy wooden batten or reed, suspended from the upper frame of the loom, was swung forward to beat the newly laid weft tightly against the previously woven cloth. The precision of this beat determined the density and firmness of the fabric. An experienced weaver maintained an even, rhythmic pressure, ensuring that the thread count per inch remained consistent from the beginning of the web to the final yard. Labor organization around the loom varied widely depending on scale and geography. In small domestic homesteads, weaving was frequently an integrated household chore performed alongside farming or seasonal duties, utilizing simple two-shaft looms to produce sturdy fabrics for family use or local barter. In contrast, urban centers of the later medieval era saw the rise of highly regulated craft guilds, where master weavers operated large horizontal looms within urban workshops, assisted by apprentices and journeymen working under strict municipal ordinances. Merchant capitalists also deployed putting-out systems, distributing prepared warps and spun yarn to rural weavers who worked in cottage sheds under piece-rate contracts, returning the finished cloth to urban drapers for finishing and sale. The choice of loom and technique was intimately tied to the type of yarn delivered to the bench. A delicate worsted yarn spun from combed top required a fine, evenly spaced reed and careful tension control on a horizontal treadle loom to produce a smooth, lightweight fabric with a crisp hand. Conversely, coarse carded wools destined for heavy woolen cloth were often woven on simpler, robust frames where the density of the fulling process would later consolidate the fabric. The weaver had to understand how the elasticity of the wool interacted with the mechanical tension of the warp, adjusting the spacing of the threads to accommodate the shrinkage that would inevitably occur during subsequent washing and fulling. Beyond the primary mechanics of shedding and beating, the preparation of the loom required intricate assembly before weaving could begin. The threaded warp had to be carefully beamed, wound onto the warp beam under even tension, and each individual thread drawn through the tiny eyes of the heddles and the narrow spaces of the reed. This threading process demanded hours of meticulous attention. A single misplaced thread or tangled heddle cord would cause a warp jam that halted production until corrected. Master weavers often relied on family members or junior apprentices to assist with drawing in, ensuring that complex twill or patterned drafts were executed without error according to local regional styles. Furthermore, workshop maintenance played an ongoing role in daily output. The wooden moving parts of the treadle loom, including the pulleys, lams, and harness frames, required regular greasing with animal fat or oil to prevent friction and squeaking during operation. The reed itself, constructed from slender reeds or split cane bound with twine, had to be inspected frequently for broken teeth that could snag the warp threads as the batten swung back and forth across the web. In addition to mechanical upkeep, master weavers in certain continental textile districts had to account for seasonal variations in workshop lighting. Because complex patterned weaves or fine dark yarns strained the eyes, weavers positioned their frames directly beneath large, unglazed or parchment-covered workshop windows, timing their most intricate drafting work to the peak hours of daylight to maintain uniform quality across the cloth web. Environmental conditions within the weaving shed played a practical role in daily operations. Because dry air caused warp threads to become brittle and prone to snapping under the constant friction of the heddles and reed, weavers often maintained damp earthen floors or placed small basins of water near the base of the loom. The added humidity kept the woolen fibers pliable and strong, reducing downtime caused by broken warp threads that required tedious mending with a weaver's knot. The scent of sized yarn, damp wood, and occasional tallow used to lubricate moving parts filled the workspace as the fabric slowly grew inch by inch upon the cloth beam. As the afternoon sun shifts across the workshop windows, the rhythmic beat of the batten continues in steady cadence. The warp threads, once scattered as raw wool across distant pastures and disciplined through washing, spinning and warping, are now locked together in a tight, orderly matrix of intersecting threads. The cloth grows slowly across the wooden cylinder of the cloth beam, recording the skill and endurance of the artisan in every yard of construction. Yet, despite the precision of the weave, the fabric remains incomplete, its fibers still retaining the oils, sizing residues, and structural stiffness that demand the transformative disciplines of fulling, raising, and shearing. The freshly woven cloth, having just been cut free from the wooden tension beams of the loom, still retained the rigid geometry of its construction. Although the warp and weft threads crossed in an orderly grid, the fabric was open, loose, and stiff with residual sizing agents, natural greases, and manufacturing oils. To transform this raw web into a dense, durable, and weather-resistant textile, it had to undergo fulling, a critical process of scouring, thickening, and felting. Across pre-industrial Europe, fulling relied on moisture, heat, alkaline agents, and sustained mechanical pressure to force the woolen fibers to interlock and consolidate, shrinking the cloth in both length and width while binding the individual threads into a unified whole. The mechanics of fulling depended fundamentally on the physical properties of wool, because individual wool fibers feature microscopic scales along their surface. Agitation in a warm, moist environment causes these scales to catch and lock together, preventing the fibers from sliding back to their original positions. This controlled shrinkage required carefully managed water and cleansing additives to remove remaining impurities, while encouraging the fibers to mat. In some districts and periods, absorbent fuller's earth was used alongside alkaline agents such as stale urine collected from households to cut through grease and assist the process. The strong scent of some mixtures historically marked fulling sites, as distinct operations separate from spinning and weaving rooms. Before the widespread adoption of mechanical fulling mills, this strenuous work was performed entirely by hand or foot. In foot fulling, often referred to as walking the cloth, workers stood knee-deep in wooden troughs filled with soapy water and urine, rhythmically treading upon the fabric for hours on end. The weight and steady motion of their feet compressed the fibers, forcing the weave to contract and thicken under constant friction. This manual method demanded considerable physical endurance and was common in small domestic settings, independent rural communities, and regions where water-powered infrastructure was either unavailable or restricted by local custom. By the later medieval period, fulling mills driven by water wheels transformed the scale of production in many major European river valleys. These mechanical mills featured heavy wooden mallets or hammers, lifted by cams on a rotating axle, and dropped rhythmically into deep wooden stocks containing the folded cloth. The continuous thumping of the wooden mallets accelerated the felting process far beyond the limits of human foot power, allowing workshops to process much larger yardages of fabric in a fraction of the time. However, the adoption of the fulling mill was uneven across geography and time. While commercial centres in England, Flanders, and northern Italy embraced water-powered stocks early on, mountainous regions, arid districts, and smaller peasant communities continued to rely on manual treading and traditional hand labour. The organisation of labour around the fulling site varied widely depending on whether the process was domestic or mechanised. In hand-fulling households, family members shared the physical burden, often working communally during seasonal processing peaks. In contrast, water-powered fulling mills were specialised operations managed by skilled millers or overseen by urban craft guilds and estate lords. Guild regulations frequently governed the operation of commercial fulling mills, establishing strict rules regarding the duration of hammering and the types of cleansing additives permitted. If cloth was beaten for too long in the stocks, the weave could become excessively felted and ruined, while insufficient fulling left the fabric loose, porous, and prone to rapid wear in damp weather. Water supply and management were central to the operation of any fulling site. Mills required a steady, dependable flow from streams or mill races to drive the heavy wooden water wheels and supply clean rinsing water for the final stages of the process. Workers diverted water into wooden troughs or sluice gates, carefully regulating the temperature and volume of the liquid entering the stocks. As the wooden hammers rose and fell, the water in the vats gradually turned thick and murky with suspended dirt, loose fibers, and spent alkaline residues, requiring periodic draining and refilling with fresh stream water to rinse the cloth thoroughly. Environmental factors also influenced the success of the fulling cycle. The ambient temperature of the water affected how rapidly the wool fibers swelled and locked together. Too cold, and the felting action stalled. Too hot, and the fabric risked uncontrolled shrinkage or structural damage. Fullers relied on tactile experience, periodically reaching into the heavy wooden vats to feel the texture of the wet cloth, judging by hand whether the weave had achieved the correct degree of shrinkage and consolidation. Beyond general mill operations, fullers had to account for the specific chemical reactions between local water minerals and cleansing agents. In districts where water was exceptionally hard, calcium and magnesium ions combined with natural soaps to form insoluble scums that deposited onto the woolen fibers, dulling the fabric and interfering with uniform shrinkage. To mitigate this, millers constructed settling ponds, or routed spring-fed supply lines through timber troughs, to filter out suspended sediments before the water entered the stocks. Furthermore, the physical construction of the fulling stocks themselves required specialized carpentry. The interior chambers, where the wooden mallets struck the folded cloth, were shaped with smooth, rounded contours to prevent the fabric from catching, tearing, or folding unevenly during the heavy pounding. If a mallet head became worn or splintered, it could snag the damp yarn, requiring immediate repair by a resident joiner before the batch could proceed. Municipal authorities and manorial courts sometimes monitored fulling discharges to prevent mills from fouling downstream water supplies used by tanners, brewers, and villagers. Regulations in many urban manufacturing zones mandated that fulling waste be channeled into settling basins or released only during specific tidal or high-flow hours, balancing industrial output with shared community water usage. In addition to discharge management, millers carefully inspected the orientation of the folded fabric between shifts, periodically turning the cloth inside out to ensure that the heavy mallets impacted all sections uniformly. Uneven pounding could leave streaks of loose weave alongside densely felted patches, compromising the overall structural integrity of the finished textile before it reached the finishing floor. Moreover, the transmission of torque from the exterior water wheel axle to the interior cam beams required frequent inspection of leather drive pins and timber teeth, as the constant vibrational strain of heavy mallets subjected the mill frame to intense mechanical fatigue during long production runs. As the cloth absorbed water, its weight increased greatly, requiring auxiliary wooden winches or manual hoisting poles to lift the sodden fabric from the deep vats for inspection. Once the desired density and weight were reached, the heavy fulling hammers were brought to a halt, and the saturated fabric was lifted from the vats. The cloth was dripping wet, reduced significantly in length and width from its original dimensions on the loom, but its individual threads were now permanently fused into a dense, cohesive textile. The harsh mechanical pounding left the fabric damp, heavy, and malleable, requiring immediate attention to restore its shape and smooth its surface before the final stages of finishing could begin. The heavy thumping of the wooden fulling mallets fades into a low murmur as the water wheels slow and the troughs are drained of their murky runoff. The dense, compacted web of woolen cloth rests in heavy, damp folds, its fibers firmly locked together by the joint action of water, alkali, and rhythmic pressure. Yet this heavy, shrunk fabric remains wet and unevenly proportioned, requiring careful handling to draw its dimensions back into true alignment and prepare its surface for the shears. The fulled cloth, extracted from the stocks in a heavy, sodden state, presented a final challenge of form and surface. The shrinking process, while essential for density and durability, had pulled the textile into an irregular, distorted shape. To restore its proper dimensions and prepare its texture for the market, the fabric had to be stretched, brushed, and cropped. Across pre-industrial Europe, these finishing tasks were often performed in specialized workshops by skilled artisans, whose tools, tentering frames, teasel brushes, and heavy iron shears represented the final mechanical refinement of the woolen cloth. The first necessity was the restoration of dimensions through tentering. The wet, shrunk cloth was stretched across large wooden frames, known as tenters, which were often erected in open fields to maximize the benefit of sunlight and steady, drying breezes. The edges of the fabric were secured to the horizontal and vertical rails of the frame by a series of small, hooked metal fasteners called tenter hooks. These hooks, driven into the timber at precise intervals, held the cloth under firm, constant tension as it dried. The worker adjusted the frame's width and height to return the fabric to its correct proportions, ensuring that the weave was squared and the dimensions matched the standards expected by local trade statutes or merchant contracts. This outdoor tentering process, while effective, required careful supervision. If the sun was too intense or the wind too harsh, the fabric risked drying unevenly or becoming stiff and brittle. Once the dimensions were stabilized, the finishing artisans turned their attention to the surface texture. For high-quality woolens, where a soft, consistent nap was desired, the cloth underwent raising. This was achieved using the seed heads of the teasel plant, Dipsacus phelonum, which possessed a unique hooked structure capable of catching and lifting the loose wool fibers from the surface of the fabric without tearing the base weave. These teasel heads were mounted into large, rectangular wooden frames, which were then drawn steadily across the surface of the damp cloth. In smaller workshops, this raising was done by hand, with the artisan manipulating the frames in a methodical, overlapping motion. In more mechanized finishing shops, rotating drums fitted with teasel heads were used to brush the cloth as it was fed through the machine, creating a consistent, velvety nap across the entire length. This raising process transformed the appearance and tactile quality of the textile. By pulling up the fibers, the fuller's previous work, which had hidden the individual threads under a felted surface, was enhanced, creating a lush, uniform pile. However, this pile was often uneven and shaggy after the initial raising, requiring the final, most delicate stage of finishing: shearing. Shearing was the art of trimming the raised nap to a precise, uniform height using massive, heavy iron shears. These tools, often weighing several pounds and shaped with long, straight blades, were handled by specialists who worked with rhythmic, sweeping motions. The shearman laid the cloth over a padded table or wooden plank and rested the broad lower blade flat against the cloth so the cutting edge would not dig into the fabric, cropping the nap to a velvet-like smoothness. The physical demands of shearing were immense. The sheer weight of the shears, combined with the necessity of maintaining an exact, level cut across hundreds of yards of fabric, required significant strength and acute eye-hand coordination. The shearing process was often slow, and a master shearman spent years perfecting the ability to graze the surface of the cloth without risking a catastrophic cut. This finishing stage was arguably the most critical for the aesthetic value of the fabric. as a perfectly sheared cloth possessed a deep, lustrous finish that commanded the highest market prices. In many urban finishing centers, shearmen formed elite guilds, jealously guarding their specialized techniques and maintaining high standards for the final output of their workshops. Labor organization in these final stages often involved significant cooperation between independent specialists and larger finishing firms. While tentering might occur on land leased near a fulling mill or a merchant's warehouse, raising and shearing were typically confined to workshops where light and workspace could be carefully controlled. In commercial putting-out systems, the finished cloth was returned to drapers who would inspect every yard for flaws, missed patches of nap, or uneven shearing marks. These inspections were rigorous, as any imperfection in the finish reflected poorly on the merchant and the reputation of the workshop, and could result in the fabric being downgraded to a lower, less profitable grade. Environmental conditions within the finishing room were managed with great care. A stable, moderate humidity was required for successful raising, as the fibers needed a degree of suppleness to be pulled up by the teasels. Conversely, shearing was best performed in rooms with clear, consistent light, often utilizing large north-facing windows to avoid the shifting glare of direct sunlight, which would have made it impossible for the shearman to spot uneven areas in the nap. The floors of these workshops were kept meticulously clean to ensure that dust or stray grit did not become embedded in the soft, finished pile. The tools themselves, the tenterhooks, teasel frames and iron shears, required constant maintenance. Tenterhooks were forged from iron and had to be replaced periodically as they rusted from exposure to the outdoor damp. Teasel heads were agricultural products, harvested in late summer and chosen for the strength and flexibility of their hooks. They were consumable items, losing their effectiveness after repeated passes over the cloth and needing to be replaced daily in high-volume shops. The shears were the most prized tools, regularly sharpened on whetstones and polished with fine sand or oil to keep the blades perfectly aligned. A master shearman would often possess a personal set of shears, maintained and calibrated to his own grip and stroke. Beyond these basic implements, finishing workshops often relied on specialized rolling tables and pressing boards. Once cropped, the fabric was frequently wound tightly around heavy wooden rollers and allowed to rest overnight, setting the nap and eliminating any creases that might have formed during handling. In certain urban centers, finishing artisans also utilized large wooden presses, fitted with heavy stone weights or screw mechanisms, to flatten the selvages and give the cloth a crisp, uniform hand before folding it for market distribution. Furthermore, municipal authorities frequently enacted strict regulations concerning the layout of tenter grounds. Because stretching frames occupied substantial tracts of open land near towns, city councils and manorial lords sometimes established boundaries to prevent tenters from encroaching on common pastures or blocking public pathways, ensuring that urban expansion did not starve finishing workshops of the essential open space required for drying and squaring cloth webs. The variety of finishes available to the finishing artisan was broad, adapted to the needs of the consumer and the quality of the wool. Some fabrics were left with a very short, tight nap, while others, intended for heavy winter garments, were raised to a thick, soft pile. In some regions, additional finishing techniques were employed, such as pressing the cloth between heavy, heated iron plates to impart a high luster, or steaming the surface to set the pile. These processes were rarely uniform, reflecting the deep regional idiosyncrasies of European textile craft, where cloth from one district could be instantly recognized by its specific finish and texture. As the heavy shears fall silent, and the final length of cloth is lifted from the cropping table, the transformation from raw, greasy fleece to a finished textile is complete. The fabric lies in smooth, neatly folded lengths, its surface uniform, its dimensions square, and its nap consistent. The finished surface, whether left in a natural state or groomed to a high, lustrous pile, stands ready for the final stages of the commercial journey, whether that involves transport to distant regional markets or, for many varieties, entry into the complex world of the dyer's vat. The finished cloth, resting in neat folds upon the workshop table, stood poised for one of the most chemically complex and economically volatile stages of pre-industrial production, dyeing. Across medieval and early modern Europe, color was never a simple matter of steeping plant material in water. It was an intricate empirical science dictated by local botanical resources, imported trade goods, mineral mordants, and strict municipal regulations. The conversion of a dull, natural woolen web into a vibrant blue, red, yellow, or deep black required specialized knowledge, heavy infrastructure, and an acute understanding of how organic compounds interacted with animal protein fibers. The preparation of cloth for the dye vat began with scouring to remove any residual grease, oil, or sizing that might prevent the dye liquor from penetrating the fibers evenly. Once cleaned, most textile fibers required a mordant, a metallic salt, most commonly alum, iron, or copper, to fix the dye permanently to the wool. Alum, imported from specialized mining centers such as Tolfa in the Papal States or domestic deposits where available, acted as a chemical bridge, binding with both the wool molecules and the dye coloring agents to ensure the shade remained fast against light and washing. Without this crucial mordanting step, many plant-based colors would quickly fade or wash out upon exposure to moisture. Among the various dye sources, blue occupied a dominant and specialized position across European manufacturing centers, derived primarily from the processing of woad, Isatis tintoria. Woad cultivation and processing formed a major agricultural and industrial enterprise in regions such as Languedoc, Thuringia, and parts of England. The harvested leaves could be crushed, formed into balls, dried, and then couched or fermented. Prepared woad was subsequently used in an alkaline vat, sometimes maintained with stale urine, to make its blue colorant available to the cloth. The dyer worked in deep vats filled with this pungent, foul-smelling liquor, submerging the pale cloth and watching it emerge greenish-yellow before turning a brilliant blue upon exposure to atmospheric oxygen. For reds, dyers relied upon a diverse range of materials depending on cost and market destination. Madder, Rubia tinctorum, cultivated extensively in the Low Countries and parts of Germany, yielded reliable brick reds, russets, and browns when combined with alum or iron mordants. For high-status textiles, however, luxury reds were produced using insect dyes such as kermes or imported cochineal, which commanded exorbitant prices and were strictly regulated by urban craft guilds to prevent fraud. Yellows were readily extracted from local plants such as weld, dyer's broom, or sawwort, though they were frequently used as base layers in complex overdying techniques to produce brilliant greens when combined with woad. The process of overdying, dipping a cloth previously dyed blue into a yellow bath, or vice versa, exemplified the sophisticated empirical skill of the master dyer. Achieving a deep, rich black, highly prized for clerical garments and urban civic wear, often required a multi-stage process involving iron mordants, logwood or gallnuts, and successive immersions in dark vats. The dyer had to constantly monitor the temperature of the liquor, the duration of the immersion, and the chemical balance of the bath. If the water became too hot or too alkaline, the delicate woolen fibers could be scorched, weakened, or stripped of their soft hand. Labor organization within the dye house contrasted sharply with the domestic isolation of spinning, or the rural decentralization of sheep raising. Dyeing was almost universally an urban enterprise, concentrated near rivers or municipal water sources capable of supplying the massive volumes of fresh water required for washing and rinsing, while simultaneously carrying away toxic effluents. Urban craft guilds strictly separated dyers into distinct categories, such as those who worked with coarse, inexpensive dyes and those licensed to use high-cost luxury imports like kermes and true indigo. This occupational division protected merchant investments and ensured that the quality of the final product met municipal trade standards. The physical environment of the dye house was harsh and demanding. Unlike the quiet rhythm of the spinning room or the mechanical clatter of the loom, the dye house was a landscape of steam, boiling vats, heavy wooden stirring paddles, and overwhelming chemical stenches. Workers labored in hot, damp air amidst acrid vapors rising from copper and lead kettles heated by roaring wood fires. The constant exposure to boiling water, corrosive mordants, and staining plant juices made dyeing one of the most physically punishing occupations in the pre-industrial textile chain, marked by stained hands and specialized protective leather aprons. Tools and equipment required careful maintenance to prevent cross-contamination between different color batches. Large wooden vats had to be scrubbed and drained regularly, while metal kettles were scoured to remove chemical residues that could ruin a delicate shade of yellow or red. The quality of the water supply was equally critical. Hard mineral water containing high concentrations of calcium or iron could interfere with the brilliance of red and yellow dyes, forcing dye houses to invest in rainwater collection systems or specific river channels known for their chemical purity. Beyond general vat management, master dyers maintained secret recipe books containing proprietary formulas for adjusting tone and saturation using adjunct substances such as tartar, bran, or stale beer. These additives helped buffer the chemical bath, ensuring that the dye struck the animal fibers evenly without leaving mottled patches across wide expanses of fabric. Furthermore, municipal authorities maintained strict oversight of dye house operations, to prevent the fraudulent substitution of inferior ingredients. Inspectors regularly visited urban workshops to check the purity of stored madder and alum stocks, penalizing artisans who attempted to stretch expensive dyestuffs with cheap earth or wood ash fillers. In addition to other colorants, some regions used particular marine mollusks or lichens, such as argil for purple and violet hues. Argil lichens were fermented with ammonia-bearing liquor, though the resulting colors generally remained fugitive. Moreover, transportation logistics played a decisive role in raw material availability, as interior workshops relied on packhorse trains and river barges to secure imported alum barrels and foreign dyewoods that arrived via coastal ports. Additionally, master dyers coordinated closely with local fuel merchants to ensure a steady supply of well-seasoned hardwood logs, as fluctuating furnace temperatures could ruin an entire vat of mordanted yarn. Furthermore, apprentice artisans were tasked with the continuous skimming of surface impurities and scum from active vats to maintain the pristine clarity of the liquor before fabric immersion. Despite the rigidity of guild rules and traditional recipes, regional variations abounded. A dyer in a small provincial town might rely entirely on locally foraged plants and simple alum substitutes, producing serviceable everyday cloths for agrarian markets, while an urban workshop in Florence or Ghent utilized imported dyewoods, fine Levantine alum, and secret family formulas to supply international merchant houses. These regional identities gave pre-industrial European textiles their distinct visual signatures, allowing buyers to identify the origin of a cloth by its characteristic shade and color fastness. As the dyed lengths of cloth are hoisted from the steaming vats, rinsed thoroughly in clean running water, and hung across wooden drying racks in the courtyard, the transformative journey of the wool reaches its penultimate threshold. The vibrant hues, whether the deep, somber tones of woad-derived blues or the rich warmth of madder reds, fix firmly into the fiber matrix. The damp, richly colored fabrics rest under the open sky, shedding their chemical moisture to the breeze before they are folded, packed into heavy canvas bales, and released into the wide, dispersed commercial networks of regional markets and long-distance trade. The heavy canvas bales, packed tight with finished and dyed woolens, leave the courtyards and workshops to enter the complex commercial arteries of pre-industrial Europe. Long before the concentration of production within steam-powered urban mills, the textile economy operated through a vast, dispersed network of domestic households, itinerant peddlers, municipal craft guilds, and merchant capitalists. This decentralized system linked rural cottages to urban markets through intricate webs of credit, piece-rate wages, and debt, ensuring that the journey of a single length of cloth was as much an exercise in social organization as it was in physical craftsmanship. At the center of this commercial apparatus stood the merchant capitalist or urban draper, who coordinated the flow of materials across disparate rural and urban sectors. Operating through the putting-out system, merchants distributed raw, washed wool to rural spinners and weavers, retaining ownership of the materials at every stage of production. Families working in small holdings or cottage workshops performed spinning and weaving as part of a mixed economy, blending agricultural chores with textile labor. While this domestic arrangement allowed household members to integrate work around seasonal farming demands, it also placed them in a position of economic vulnerability. Spinners and weavers relied heavily on merchant advances for raw materials and food, frequently accumulating debts that tied their labor to low, heavily regulated piece-rate wages. In contrast, urban manufacturing centers were heavily shaped by the authority of craft guilds. Across medieval and early modern towns, guilds of weavers, fullers, shearers, and dyers maintained strict monopolies over their respective trades, enforcing regulations designed to control output quality, limit competition, and protect master artisans from outside disruption. Guild statutes dictated the permissible dimensions of cloth, the types of tools that could be used, and the conditions under which apprentices and journeymen labored. While guild membership offered a degree of economic security and mutual aid for master craftsmen, it also erected rigid barriers against outsiders, women, and unapprenticed workers, creating a distinct hierarchy between urban guild masters and rural domestic producers. The relationship between urban merchant elites and rural laborers was frequently tense, characterized by ongoing negotiations over wages, quality standards, and delivery schedules. Merchants sought to minimize production costs and ensure timely delivery to satisfy distant markets, often pressing rural workers to increase output. Workers, meanwhile, struggled against falling piece rates and the constant threat of indebtedness, sometimes engaging in surreptitious practices such as retaining small quantities of wool or substituting lower-grade fibers to supplement their meager earnings. These tensions highlighted the underlying economic friction of a system where the physical execution of labor was entirely divorced from the ownership of capital and finished goods. Beyond local cottage networks and guild-regulated workshops, cloth distribution relied on a hierarchy of markets, ranging from weekly regional fairs to international merchant exchanges. Smallholder producers and rural artisans brought their surplus cloth or spun yarn to local market towns, where regional buyers, clothiers, and small-scale traders gathered to inspect goods laid out on wooden trestle tables. Municipal authorities maintained strict oversight of these market days, inspecting textiles for flaws or fraudulent measurements in public cloth halls before permitting sales to proceed. For high-grade commercial woolens, distribution expanded far beyond local boundaries, feeding into major international trade networks managed by powerful merchant coalitions. The transport of these bulky textile bales required diverse logistical arrangements suited to regional infrastructure. Overland transport depended on pack-horse trains navigating muddy cart tracks and mountain passes, or heavy wagons rumbling along seasonal trade routes. Where navigable waterways were available, river barges and coastal vessels carried bales of cloth downstream toward major ports and urban distribution hubs, linking interior production zones with maritime commercial networks spanning the continent. Each transfer of the cargo, from cottage cart to pack horse, from river barge to merchant warehouse, incurred handling fees, tolls, and customs duties levied by local lords and municipal governments. Beyond general transport logistics, the financial settlement of these transactions involved complex credit instruments and foreign exchange mechanisms. Because physical coinage was frequently scarce or unreliable in provincial markets, merchants relied on bills of exchange, tally sticks, and deferred payment schedules negotiated at major international fairs, such as those held in Champagne or later in Antwerp and Lyon. These financial networks connected local rural spinners indirectly, through merchants and contractors, to distant urban banking houses, binding the entire agrarian textile labor force to the fluctuations of continental monetary supply. Furthermore, municipal authorities maintained vigilant oversight of weights and measures during market exchanges to prevent fraud. Official standards, often cast in bronze or stone and kept securely within the town hall or market cross, were used by civic officials to verify that commercial lengths of cloth matched official specifications. Any merchant caught altering measuring rods or selling undersized webs faced severe fines, public pillorying, or temporary revocation of trading privileges within the municipal jurisdiction. In addition to formal market halls, itinerant peddlers played a vital distribution role, carrying smaller bundles of coarse woolen cloth, yarn, and notions on foot or via pack animals into remote upland valleys and isolated farming communities that lacked direct access to urban merchants. These peddlers acted as essential economic intermediaries, bridging the gap between centralized urban production zones and peripheral rural consumers who relied on seasonal trade visits to acquire necessary garments and household textiles. Moreover, local seigneurial lords frequently asserted rights to levy market tolls and stallage fees on traders operating within their domain, inserting an additional layer of feudal extraction into the commercial exchange of manufactured goods before urban merchant capital gained total dominance over regional trade corridors. Additionally, regional customs unions and early protective tariffs enacted by territorial princes often forced merchants to reroute transport caravans to avoid exorbitant transit taxes, shaping the physical geography of European cloth distribution across political boundaries. Furthermore, shipping insurers and early marine underwriters in coastal commercial hubs began offering specialized coverage policies for maritime textile cargo, protecting merchant capital against the ever-present risks of shipwreck, piracy, and water damage during long-distance transit across the North Sea and the Mediterranean. In addition to marine underwriting, warehouse clerks maintained meticulous inventory ledgers, recording the exact brand marks, bale numbers, and quality grades of stored textiles to facilitate rapid sorting and tax assessment by visiting royal auditors. Furthermore, postal couriers and specialized messenger services contracted by wealthy merchant syndicates carried vital market intelligence regarding price fluctuations, crop failures, and currency values between major European trading exchanges. Despite the commercial pressures and financial uncertainties that shadowed the textile trade, the domestic reality of cloth production remained deeply embedded in everyday household life. Even in regions heavily integrated into merchant-driven putting-out systems, families retained a portion of their spun yarn or woven fabric to meet immediate domestic needs. The labor of women spinning at the hearth and men working the handloom provided essential garments for family use, supplementing whatever could be purchased with meager piece rate earnings. This duality, where the same hands produced luxury goods for international markets and coarse wear for domestic survival, defined the lived experience of pre-industrial textile labor. As the afternoon gives way to twilight, the bustling activity of the market square begins to quiet. The heavy wagons are unloaded, the merchant ledgers are closed, and the final bales of finished cloth find their resting places in secure warehouses or modest cottage corners. Among the various lengths distributed across the community, one folded piece of warm woolen fabric is carried back through the darkening lanes toward a quiet rural dwelling, its long journey from pasture and fleece drawing to a peaceful close under the fading evening light. The dark wool rests upon a low oak board, its woven surface catching the last low rays of amber light that slip across the floorboards. To the touch, it is dense, dry, and slightly heavy, its surface clean after scouring, fulling, careful rinsing, and finishing. It has no sheen of silk, nor the bright, sharp color of imported Mediterranean dyestuffs or costly kerms, but rather the deep, honest tone of unbleached earth, a rich oatmeal mixed with the shadow of charcoal, or the soft brown of a dry acorn shell. Folded square upon square, corner meeting precise corner, the cloth possesses a quiet dignity born entirely of slow repetition. Every inch of its length bears the evidence of an anonymous community of labor, a chain of touch reaching from the high upland pastures down through the narrow doorways of valley cottages, across valleys and across generations. The precise manner of this making has never worn a single face. In some northern hills where the stone walls are high and the winters bite deep, households turn out a thick, coarse wadmal, matted heavy by fulling stocks or simply by the rhythmic tramping of feet in wooden troughs, designed to weather horizontal rain and sleet without a shiver. Down in the sheltered southern vales, the weave runs finer and lighter, combed with long-toothed irons into a worsted smoothness that drapes over a shoulder like water. Some work belongs wholly to the kitchen hearth, where a single family shears, washes, cards, and spins the whole of their annual wear by the light of a rushwick. Other lengths pass through the strict gates of walled towns, where guildmasters set standard measures for the width of a loom and the weight of a bolt, or move through the cool stone chambers of specialist workshops where dyers dip skeins into vats of woad until their fingers turn a permanent indigo blue. Whether shaped by the independent rhythm of a remote homestead or the regulated hours of a guild hall, the work remains fundamentally the same, a patient negotiation between human hands and the unruly substance of nature. Before this final folding, the web endured the patient trials of the finisher's art, where wet cloth was stretched upon wooden frames and brushed with the dried hook heads of teasels to raise a soft, protective nap that would turn the wind. Later, the raised surface was trimmed evenly with large cloth finishing shears, leaving a smooth face ready for the needle and the seam. Even now, tucked into the weave, lie the small, neat patches and mending threads that speak of thrift, where an older length of yarn was unraveled and reused as binding or lining. Beyond the cutting floor, this same cloth is destined for many hands and varied everyday uses, from the heavy hooded cloaks worn by drovers sleeping out beneath open carts, to the simple petticoats and warm waistcoats that shield milkmaids against the morning dew. In some households, lengths are measured out carefully for trade, bartered at the village crossroads or the seasonal fair for iron nails, salt, and blocks of beeswax, passing from neighbor to neighbor without a single coin changing hands. In the quiet interior of the dwelling, the shifting shadows grow long and blue as dusk settles over the thatch. The air smells faintly of lanolin, old timber, dried fuller's earth, and the sweet, dry scent of rushes scattered on the floor. Upon the rough bench beside the hearth, the tools of the long process finally stand at rest. The spinning wheel, which has hummed like a low hive through countless morning hours and afternoon shadows, is still at last. Its drive band hangs slightly slack around the whirl, and a single stray filament of wool clings to the flyer hook, fluttering gently in the faint draught from the chimney. The bobbin is full, its surface wound with an even pale grey yarn that waits patiently for the next setting of the warp. But tonight, the treadle will feel no foot. Nearby, the heavy frame of the handloom casts a tall, skeletal shadow against the whitewashed wall. The heddles hang quiet, and the shuttle rests inside its box at the end of the race beam, its wooden belly polished smooth by decades of passage through the shed. No rhythmic thud-clack echoes through the rafters now. The warp threads are tensioned, steady, and silent, holding the memory of movement within their fixed parallel lines. The carding paddles, bristling with fine wire teeth, lie face down upon a stool, their work finished until the next season of fleece preparation. Every instrument of wood, bone, iron, and plant fiber has found its proper place, laid aside with the easy grace of tools that know their labor has been well and truly done. Beyond the hearth, in the dim corner where the timber chests are stacked against the damp, other finished bolts and spare garments find their evening storage. Wrapped securely in coarse linen or lavender-sprigged linen bags to keep away the moths and the winter damp, they lie in neat horizontal stacks, waiting for the coming cold or the next fair day when a trader's pack horse will carry them toward the valley market. These stored textiles represent the true wealth of the household, not coin of gold or silver, but stored hours, patient sunlight, and the secure shelter of family warmth against the frost. The room itself seems to draw inward, wrapping its silence around the inhabitants like a thick blanket of the very cloth that now rests upon the board. Outside, the last cries of the crows wheeling over the stubble fields fade into the vast, darkening stillness of the countryside. The small window pane, thick and slightly green, dims until it mirrors only the gentle glow of the hearth fire, which flickers down to a bed of glowing, ember-red coals. There is no urgency left in the air, no pending task demanding the turn of a wheel or the pull of a baton. The season's fleece has crossed the bridge from raw grease and tangled lock to a finished, folded shelter against the cold. Upon the central table, the topmost fold of the woolen fabric catches a final spark of orange light before the fire settles into ash. Its texture is visible in the dimming room, a regular, interlocking landscape of tiny loops and turns, each thread laid precisely beside its neighbor by human patience and steady eyesight. It is a surface made entirely of small things, thousands of downward strokes of a comb, millions of tiny twists of the fingers drawing out the roving, and countless passes of the shuttle sliding back and forth across the width of the bench. No single moment of the process was grand or miraculous, yet together they have summoned warmth and structure out of the open air and the hillside grass. As the house grows cooler, and the shadows pool deeper in the corners of the low-ceilinged room, the mind naturally follows the slowing pace of the tools. The distant bleat of sheep on the dark hill is swallowed by the night, and the wind outside merely whispers against the eaves without disturbing the peace within. The folded wool remains where it was laid, heavy, complete, and silent, a small island of human order in the vast, quiet turning of the evening. Here, at the end of the long journey from pasture to room, there is nothing more that needs to be done, and the quiet earth itself seems to settle into rest.